after over a decade of exploring atheism, I no longer take it seriously.
Okay, pack it up, everybody. Time to go home. Cameron Bertuzzi no longer takes atheism seriously. It's over for us, folks.
I want to bring math to the table. So using probability theory and some awesome, amazing new software that I built over Christmas. Yes, I code on my holidays. I'll visually demonstrate why atheism is non-serious.
Yes, you heard that right. Our good friend Cameron from Capturing Christianity is going to be going over 3 evidences for theism today, and he's going to be using math. And by math, he totally doesn't mean just pulling random numbers out of nowhere and assigning them as supposed probabilities to his various arguments on a completely arbitrary basis. No, because instead of spending time together with his friends and family over the holidays, Cameron has spent who knows how many countless hours developing this very real, important, and not at all unnecessary or dumb program to visualize the probability of his arguments, which again, I just want to say, are definitely very real and based in math and are not just totally made up. Let's give it a listen. Let's see. His arguments were:
Number 1, the universe is orderly. Number 2, the universe is fine-tuned for life. Number 3, there is consciousness. After we work through these 3 pieces of evidence for theism, then we'll introduce the problem of evil, the argument that atheists love to bring up, and we'll see how it impacts the overall situation.
Order, fine-tuning, and consciousness. So let's start with that first one and see how it goes, shall we?
All right, let's start with our first piece of evidence, order. When I talk about order, what I mean is that all objects in the universe are subject to the same laws everywhere and at all times. This universal consistency throughout the universe is actually astonishing. It's not exactly something that we would just expect to find by chance.
Okay, so a few flaws in Cameron's logic are already apparent. Namely, what basis does he have to say what we should and should not expect in a universe with and without a God? He seems to try to get away with this multiple times in the video, as we shall see, where he just says, well, we would not expect so-and-so, or we would expect this in an atheistic universe, and Cameron never offers any kind of justification or argument to justify any of these intuitions of his. So here's our first example. Cameron intuitively feels like there should be no expectation for uniformity or order, or for the laws or constants of physics to apply at everywhere in the universe. So Cameron intuitively feels like there should be no reason to expect that this should be the case. But is there actually any reason to think this? There simply is no basis from which you could form this expectation that Cameron has just asserted. Nobody, not a single human alive today, understands what space-time even is on a quantum scale. There is a classical understanding of space-time within Einstein's relativity, but that breaks down on small scales. Nobody understands what's happening on those small scales, how space and time behave on those small scales, how space-time is generated, what even is space and time, or reality itself on a truly fundamental layer. Like, physics just is not there yet to answer those questions. It may one day, maybe one day we will have a theory of quantum gravity, but without such a theory, without understanding the actual fundamentals of what space is, how can we form an expectation about should the constants or laws of nature, which I just want to make clear are descriptions of the universe around us that are constructed by humans, is there an expectation about should these descriptions that we construct be universally applicable or not? And how can we have any basis to generate such an expectation one way or the other if we don't even understand what space is? Like, if I can't explain to you how this space thing is generated and how 2 different objects can be separated in this space, where it comes from, what it is on a truly fundamental level, if I can't answer any of that, as physics cannot currently, then how could I say, well, there's no way that I would expect for the things that apply over here in space to also apply over here in space? How can you generate that expectation at all? There's literally no basis for it. And this is a huge, major, glaring hole in all of Cameron's reasoning to follow that he just doesn't seem to be aware of. Like, there doesn't seem to be any thought in his head about, hey, why do I have this expectation? Where does it come from? How do I justify this expectation? Nope, he just claims it. And then he's going to plug it into his magical little program that he created that's going to calculate all the probabilities and show us how silly atheism is, all because Cameron has just asserted an unjustified assumption and slipped it past us and thinks he can get away with it.
First, what we got to do is evaluate the likelihood of the evidence given the various hypotheses. Okay, so here's how the evidence affects the probabilities in this case. So under perfect being theism, that's our first probability we need to assign. Order actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, a perfect being would value rationality, consistency, and beauty, all of which are reflected in universal laws. So order allows, for example, for a stable, predictable universe, a framework where life, creativity, and moral growth can flourish. So it's pretty plausible that a perfect being would actually create a universe with consistent order. So let's conservatively, though, let's be conservative here. We don't want to assign too much of a probability here. Let's assign something like 50%. Okay, it's 50% likely, 0.5, that a perfect being would create an orderly universe.
Okay, so as you can see, there's not any actual math that goes into any of these probabilities. It's literally just whatever number Cameron is feeling like. It's all just vibes based. But let's just go back to, once again, Cameron's unjustified assumptions, because he introduces a few more for us now. Namely, he says that a perfect being would, of course, care about things like consistency, rationality, beauty, stability. Cameron has packed so much that hinges on this idea of perfect. And how do you define perfect? And what is this notion of perfection? Cameron says that a perfect God would value rationality. And yet, the universe we see around us has lots of irrational actors in it. So, a perfect God would have created everything perfectly rationally without much opportunity for free will, because that introduces imperfections. So, the existence of free will in Cameron's own worldview would seem to go against this very idea of what a perfect God would and would not do. I mean, I would think that a perfect God would not even bother creating life because he would have already been perfect. There would have been no need to change anything about his initial state, because it would have already been perfect. For God to change or to create anything or make any kind of change from this initial state of perfection would be leading away from perfection, and thus the act of an imperfect God. So really, if we critically examine any of Cameron's logic or intuitions or assumptions here, they all critically fall apart. And at the end of the day anyway, he's just saying, oh, well, I just kind of feel like this is pretty plausible, so let's just randomly assign it a probability of 50%. Again, and he's claiming that he's using math here. I think he's just confusing numbers with math. Yes, Cameron, you're using numbers, but you're not using math or probability. You're just pulling them out of a hat and seeing what sticks.
So limited theism could also explain order, but here's the problem with limited theism. Creating a universe where every object follows the same laws everywhere and at all times is actually a really big deal. Like it seems kind of difficult. A limited deity might lack the power, they might lack the knowledge, or even the motivation to achieve such perfect consistency throughout the universe. So while order is definitely possible under limited theism, it's far less likely than it is under perfect being theism. So again, we're going to be conservative. Let's assign this a probability of 10%. So 0.1.
So let's back up a minute there and just break down what Cameron is doing here. Because yes, he is making up more numbers and just randomly assigning probabilities to things arbitrarily with absolutely no basis or justification. But he's differentiating here between perfect being theism and limited being theism. Presumably just perfect being theism is pretty straightforward. Perfection, all powerful, all good, all knowing. It's basically Cameron's idea of a Christian God, right? Limited being theism is a little bit more confusing, as it just seems to be anything that falls short of perfect being theism that is not atheism. In which case, Cameron's reasoning is just really strange and just completely irrational here, as to saying, well, a limited God might not be as powerful, so maybe he wouldn't be able to maintain such perfect order. But, like, no, he could still be all powerful. And that's still limited because he doesn't have to be all good or all knowing. So he could be all powerful and all knowing and just not all good. And that would make him a limited God according to Cameron's definition. So you could still have an all powerful God of order that has a probability of 100%, I would guess, based on Cameron's vibes here. So, like, again, he's just... I mean, there's just absolutely no consistency. There's no standards. There's no mathematical rigor of any kind here. He's just throwing numbers out there.
All right, let's now turn to atheism. So under atheism, why would we expect every particle in the universe to behave in exactly the same way at all times and in all places? Why not just pure chaos? Some atheistic scenarios might even allow for order, but these are very rare exceptions. Most atheistic universes would look completely chaotic, with objects behaving unpredictably or following, and here's a key point here, they might be just following local, inconsistent rules, right? You don't have to have rules that are consistent throughout the universe. You could have local patches of order. So, but let's be generous again and assign the probability of order under atheism at 1 in 1,000 or 0.1%.
Yeah, Cameron, thanks. That's very, very generous of you. Just making up a random, very low probability. Great. I wish that it was based on any sort of arguments or had any sort of mathematical validity at all whatsoever, but I'm glad that you feel like the odds of 1 in 1,000 feels like it might be right. Come on, dude. Why would you expect this to be convincing to anyone? You haven't justified any of the numbers that you're throwing out there. All he has said is that Cameron personally doesn't see a reason why we would expect order in an atheistic universe, even though we don't understand the fundamentals of what the universe even is. Like, there just literally is no basis for which a person could assign these numbers. We are epistemologically limited as people, and we don't know everything, and we certainly do not know enough about how the universe works in order to assign the kinds of probabilities that Cameron thinks that he can assign based on his own personal intuitions here. I mean, he even says that there's no reason to think that, like, the laws or the constants of nature would be global instead of local. Well, I think actually, Cameron, it's a lot more perfect for your God to have local laws rather than universal laws. If you're just asking me about what I think is more perfect, because a perfect all good God would do all good things. And sometimes bad things happen because the laws of the universe are so uniform and consistent. Sometimes babies die because gravity is working right there at that right time. And if maybe the laws of physics were a little bit different, then innocents wouldn't die, or, gamma ray bursts wouldn't cause mass extinction, or there are so many different things in the world that I would point to as being signs of imperfection, things that are definitely not perfect, not a perfect, all good, all loving, all powerful God would do. There are very clear elements of our world that go against that, like Cameron mentions with the problem of evil. And a God that can change the laws of physics because they're not universal and they apply locally, I would think would create a much more perfect universe in terms of moral perfection. But Cameron just wants to say, maybe in his notion of perfection, 100% universally applicable laws is more perfect. This is the issue with perfection as a guide, because perfect is not an objective term. Like, perfect is subjective. My perfect is going to be different than somebody else's perfect. The things I think are perfection are suited to my own subjective tastes. I think it's more perfect for the universe to be morally perfect and have no evil in it at all. And such a universe might not have universal laws and constants. It might have local laws and constants that can be manipulated by a perfect God to make the universe more perfect. But Cameron doesn't consider any of this because Cameron has an agenda where he wants, at the end of this whole video, he wants perfect theism to be that number one most probable, and then atheism to be so improbable that it's, quote, silly. And Cameron's going to make up whatever numbers will suit that agenda.
Now let's see what happens when we add in the next piece of evidence. Let's move on to fine tuning. Gravity is strong enough to hold planets together, but it's not so strong that stars are going to collapse in on themselves, right? You've got the right number in that gravitational constant. The same goes for countless other constants like the cosmological constant, which governs the expansion of the universe. And here's what's important here, though. The numbers that we see in these constants, they didn't have to fall into life-permitting ranges. And in fact, they're so precise that changing just one constant by even a fraction could render the entire universe lifeless.
Wait a minute, Mr. Bertuzzi, I have a question, sir. How do you know literally any of that? I don't think that you do. Because Cameron just said here that, well, if these constants were different, then we wouldn't have life. Okay, Cameron, well, why don't you demonstrate that? Do you know all of the parameter space for which life can exist? No, you don't know that. You don't know that. So then, do you know that any of these constants could feasibly be different? No. Okay, no, you don't know that either, since none of them have ever been recorded or measured to be any different. So, you said that there is no reason why these constants have the values that they have. How do you know that, Cameron? How do you know that there is no reason why they have those values? Because you don't know that at all either. Like, literally, his entire argument here is just unjustified assumption after intuition after unjustified assumption. None of it stands up to any amount of scrutiny. I mean, you guys know my issues with the fine-tuning arguments. I've made a video on it before. My big issue is that all of the fine-tuning arguments start out with the statement, if these values could be different, then this. Well, that's a big if, and that's an if that I'm not just willing to accept. Just because you can change a 2 to a 3 on a sheet of paper in a physics equation doesn't mean that that constant could actually attain that value in reality, because you don't know why it has the value that it does. And until you know that reason, assuming that it could just occupy any other value from 0 to infinity is completely unjustifiable for you to make. And all of the arguments for fine-tuning rest upon that unjustified assumption.
Let's quantify this with an example. Dr. Luke Barnes, a cosmologist, has calculated that the odds of getting the right value for the cosmological constant are 1 in 10 to the 90th. 1 in 10 to the 90th. I don't know why I'm doing this. That's a decimal. Okay, if you don't know the math here, that's a decimal followed by 90 zeros before you hit a 1. To put that into perspective, that would be like basically randomly picking one specific atom out of the entire observable universe and somehow picking the right one. That's the probability that we're talking about here by chance. Okay, and according to Barnes, when you combine all of the known fine-tuned constants, the odds drop to, here it is, 1 in 10 to the 136. At this point, these sorts of numbers are so small, it's almost impossible to imagine.
Okay, first of all, I just have to point out that Cameron can't even read correctly because Dr. Barnes said all of our estimates, and Cameron read this as all of the known fine-tuned constants.
When you combine all of the known fine-tuned constants, the odds drop to...
Like, there's no known fine-tuned constants because we don't know that any of these constants are fine-tuned because we don't actually know what the full range of possible values are for any of these constants. We don't know what is possible because we don't know what actually is contributing to why their values are the way that they are. To give you an example, Fermi's constant used to be a constant in nature until the discovery of quantum mechanics and more underlying physics, which explained what went into Fermi's constant and why it had the value it did and why it couldn't have been any other value. That is at least one example of when we used to think that a certain constant was fundamental and we didn't know why it had the value it did. We then learned more fundamental physics, which explained why that constant had that value and showed us that the true range of possible values for that constant was super, super duper small. It couldn't have been 0 to infinity in any number along that number line, because there were very specific reasons why it was the value that it did. We just didn't know about that before we made further scientific discoveries. Cameron has offered us absolutely no reason or arguments why all of the other constants would not be similar, having real reasons why they have the values that they do. And we just don't know what those reasons are yet because, newsflash, Cameron and other Christian apologists who use the fine-tuning argument, we do not understand the fundamental physics of our reality yet. You literally cannot make the fine-tuning argument until you reach that point of understanding the actual fundamental physics of our reality. If you don't, you cannot make the fine-tuning argument because there's no way you could possibly know what the range of possible values is for any of these constants. And Cameron cites Luke Barnes, for example, but if we just pull up the paper that he was citing and we read what are some of these estimates that Luke Barnes was saying, we can see here that for the cosmological constant, given a uniform distribution, there you go, you have to assume a uniform distribution. Same thing with the Higgs. Here we go. Given a uniform distribution between the values of 0 and the Planck mass, each one of these different estimates for likelihood, which again ends with this absurdly small number of 10 to the negative 136, each and every single one of the arguments that's used to calculate this number rests upon the fundamental and unjustified assumption of what are the range of possibilities for these constants. Remember, all observations ever show us one value, except for the cosmological constant, which the new DESI data is showing could change over time, which was his very first argument, so you might have to update that one if the cosmological constant isn't even a constant. But again, this is illustrative of the fact that these fundamental constants that we have now are subject to change as we learn new physics and we get new empirical data of the universe. It's science. It's subject to change once we refine our understanding and develop new, more fundamental physics. You see, Luke Barnes, just like Cameron and the other Christian apologists, fundamentally makes this same starting assumption that, well, hey, any of these values, these constants, they could be any value between 0 and infinity, and you could just pick them at random and see what happens to the equations. But no, that's not how the universe works. You first need a reason to think that these constants could be different values, or you need to understand why they are the value that they are. If you don't know that they could be different, if you don't know why they are what they are, then you don't know what the range of possible values for them is, and you cannot possibly do any of these calculations of probability because there just aren't enough facts of the universe that are known for any person to conclude that the universe is finely tuned in reality. You can only say that it's finely tuned on paper if we just manipulate the physics equations and change numbers around, which again, we don't know if that's a valid thing to even do.
All right, let's go ahead and add fine-tuning as another piece of evidence. So let's add it here. We'll write it in fine-tuning. All right, so now we're ready to evaluate under our different hypotheses. So first of all, perfect being theism. A perfect being wouldn't necessarily have to create a life-permitting, orderly universe. He could create something else like an orderly realm filled with angels. But it's pretty plausible that a perfect being might value a universe capable of sustaining life as a sort of consequence of his laws, maybe as a reflection of his creativity and his goodness. But let's be, again, conservative and assign this a relatively low probability of 1 in 1,000, or again, 0.1%.
Once again, we see that these probabilities are just completely random and arbitrary, and personally, I think that a perfect being would not create any other beings because they're already perfect. There's no need to create anything. Like, if you create anything, then the universe as a whole is less perfect. So a truly perfect being would never change and would never create anything. So already, I think that a perfect being, the probability of us living in a fine-tuned universe for life with a perfect being is 0, in my opinion. But go off, King.
It's far less likely that a being with limited abilities could or would produce a life-permitting universe, but still it's not fantastically implausible. We're limited beings and we fine-tune things all the time when we have a chance, so let's set this probability at 1 in 1 million.
Again, Cameron's entire notion of what is entailed by a limited God is just completely wrong and ill-founded. I mean, an all-powerful God of life would literally count as a limited God here because they're not all-knowing and all-good. So if that's the case, an all-powerful God of life would 100,000% create a fine-tuned universe for life. So that probability should be 1. So then you're asking, what are the probabilities that out of all of the space of possible gods that you would have a God that's powerful enough and cares enough to create life? But like, again, the probability of a perfect being creating life is basically 0. So any probability for any of these other limited gods is going to be higher than the perfect being. So once again, we see Cameron's math is just pulled out of his...
Here's where things get ridiculous, all right? On atheism, there is no guiding intelligence. It's all pure dumb luck, all right? The odds of hitting a life-permitting universe by chance are astronomical. We've already talked about it, but let's be very generous to the atheists. There's a point why I'm doing this actually, because it's going to break my software if I actually put in the right numbers. But let's be generous and say that it's 1 in a trillion or 1 in 10 to the 12th power. All right, so even though that's wildly optimistic compared to the real number that Luke Barnes has calculated, let's go ahead and plug that in here.
Oh, right. The real number that Luke Barnes calculated based on all of those unjustifiable assumptions, just assuming what the range of possibilities for these numbers in, when there is no actual way that Luke Barnes or any other human could possibly know that information. So completely ill-founded. You can't even start. Like, his entire baseline begins with, given my assumption, then I can calculate this. But we can't give that assumption because that assumption is not justified. And yet Cameron just looks at it and says, well, hey, Luke Barnes is a physicist, so that must be the real number for the real probability of fine-tuning. It's like, dude, like, the numbers that Cameron is just making up here for the other probabilities are like only slightly worse than using the number that Luke Barnes calculated. It's just he's dressing it up to make it sound much more rigorous and mathematically based than it actually is. Like, if we were to even be trying to do a good faith analysis of this, like, all of these probabilities, every single probability that Cameron has given us so far is incalculable. Like, there literally is like an epistemological limit of our knowledge that prevents us from having the required information that would be necessary to calculate any of these probabilities. So yeah, I mean, of course Cameron just has to make them up.
All right, let's now add one more crucial clue to the mix. Before we get to the problem of evil, let's turn now to consciousness. All right, so starting with perfect being theism, if a perfect being exists, it wouldn't be too surprising to find that this being has created conscious creatures. Why? Well, first of all, a perfect being would recognize the intrinsic value of consciousness. Consciousness is pretty valuable. Consciousness enables rational thought. It enables love, creativity, moral understanding, and good, deep relationships, all of which align with a perfect creator's values. The existence of conscious creatures fits really naturally, actually, on a perfect being hypothesis. But let's conservatively assign this a probability of 50%, so 0.5.
even if I were to just grant what Cameron just said about how all those things align with a perfect being's values, if a perfect being who perfectly embodies all of those values were to create imperfect beings like us, conscious creatures, then they would be making those values farther away from perfection as a whole. So that would be an imperfect act to do if perfection is the goal, which it should be for a perfect being. So again, a perfect being would literally never create conscious creatures because it would make them less perfect if they did so.
Now, under atheism, consciousness is wildly unexpected. I can't sugarcoat this at all. In a universe that's already orderly and fine-tuned, life itself is still a staggering rarity, okay? The odds of randomly assembling the right conditions for even the simplest forms of life are astronomically low.
Because you would not calculate the odds of abiogenesis based on the probabilities of just randomly assembling life by chance. Maybe that's actually a horrible, terrible way to calculate such a probability if you were genuinely interested in what the odds of abiogenesis really were. You might want to look at what sort of conditions would be conducive to such a process happening. You wouldn't just take a random environment with a random mix of chemicals, throw them all together randomly, and then calculate the probability of life coming out. That would be very, very stupid and silly of you to do. So please tell me that's not what you're doing, right, Cameron? I mean, we already talked about this whole expectation thing and how you actually have no basis to claim what you would expect with or without a God because you haven't offered any case, argument, reason, or evidence to justify those expectations. Clearly, you're about to do it right now, right? Right, Cameron? We're almost at the end of the video. This is your last argument. This is your last opportunity. You're about to justify some of those assumptions for us, right, Cameron? You're not just gonna make claims about your own intuitions and then assign random probabilities to them again, are you?
But even if life somehow emerges on atheism, this leap to consciousness is an entirely different level of improbability. Consciousness introduces something radically new, subjective experience. Unlike physical properties like mass or charge, which are publicly accessible and measurable, consciousness gives its subject privileged access to mental states. So for example, only you know that you're in pain. Your awareness of it is fundamentally different from any external observation.
No, Cameron. No, it's not. You could scan someone's brain and see if they were aware of experiencing pain or not. Those kinds of states, those conscious states of awareness, do have neural correlates which are externally observable. So even just right now, and you trying to even explain what consciousness is or what makes it different, you've already failed and gotten basic facts of neuroscience wrong.
It's like sudden emergence of a property so unlike everything else in a physical universe is deeply puzzling under atheism. Why would blind, unguided processes produce beings capable of self-awareness, rational thought, and moral understanding?
Because, Cameron, it's evolutionarily advantageous to have all of those things. Organisms with all of those things behave in a more fit manner for less energetic costs. That's why those things evolved. You've claimed that consciousness is so unlike everything else in the entire universe because it involves the generation of a subjective experience, but that's not the case either. Consciousness is actually similar to other processes in that it is an information processing phenomenon. So it takes inputs, processes them into outputs. You have sensory inputs, you become consciously aware of those as well as your thoughts, feelings, sensations. Those are your inputs. They feed into your conscious awareness, and then you generate an output, a behavioral output. That's very similar to other sorts of information processing. It's just that there's an added step of generating a subjective experience, physically generating it in the brain using neurons and neurochemistry. in order to have a more energetically efficient way of processing that information. If you think about a philosophical zombie, right? Somebody that can do all the same behaviors as us conscious entities do, but they don't have the self-awareness, well, you're going to have to pre-program in every single one of those responses. So if stimuli A, then behavior B. That's a lot of various things that you have to program in for a lot of different kinds of stimuli that you might just randomly encounter in the environment. Now, if you have consciousness there, then you don't have to pre-program in all of these various outcomes in advance. Instead, a much better system that evolved in our brains is pre-programming subjective experience. A conscious awareness is generated in the brain, and the inputs are instead fed into that conscious experience, that subjective awareness that you experience as yourself, as your own awareness. And things like perceptions, sensations, emotions, thoughts, desires, all of these things are these inputs into this conscious system from other areas of the brain. And instead of having each and every single behavior pre-programmed into every stimulus in advance, like a non-conscious brain would have to do, which is very, very energetically taxing, both in development, in maintenance. I mean, you have to have a huge brain to pre-program in every single possible behavior that you could have in your life, right? Instead, what's pre-programmed in are things like self-preservation drives. Like, you have a natural tendency to want to preserve your own conscious self and keep your awareness going. So instead of having to pre-program in all these responses for self-preservation, which there could be, millions of potential responses that would go towards self-preservation, you just have this programmed in self-preservation and this conscious awareness of all of these sensations, and boom, it's a completely energetically favorable way to get evolutionarily fit, favorable behaviors to a wide variety of dynamic, unique stimuli in this kind of environment that requires long-term strategic planning for optimal survival. So yes, consciousness compared to not consciousness is immensely evolutionarily advantageous and favorable. Makes 100% sense why consciousness would evolve. It just doesn't make sense to Cameron. And Cameron thinks that if it doesn't make sense intuitively to him, then it must be some sort of logical flaw or some sort of thing that all of the biologists and philosophers that are atheists and naturalists they just must be missing. Or Cameron thinks that he has some sort of gotcha here with just the existence and evolution of consciousness. Because it doesn't make sense to him, then it can't make sense to anybody, apparently.
In a godless universe, consciousness isn't just a fluke, it's a fluke of a fluke, layered on top of the already improbable emergence of life. Even being generous, the probability of consciousness arising under atheism is vanishingly, that's what I meant to say, vanishingly small. But let's set it at 1 in a million. All right, let's be generous here.
Wow, well, I'm so glad that Cameron is being generous with us and giving it only 1 in a million odds, right? Golly gee. Okay, we can drop this farce now. I mean, that was the last little probability that Cameron was going to make up. And then, of course, he's going to plug it all into his little program, and it's going to show us, what a coincidence, the worldview that Cameron believes in is the most probable one, according to the program that Cameron wrote. What a shocker. According to the probabilities that Cameron randomly made up with no logical or empirical basis, turns out atheism is just so improbable it might as well have a probability of 0. So I guess all of us have just been too silly. None of us ever thought about, well, hey, why didn't we think about Cameron's intuitions about these things? Like, if we just forgot to think about what Cameron Bertuzzi thinks about this and what kind of feeling he has for how probable it is. Because Cameron feels like it's probably we would have all this chaos if atheism was real. So based on that feeling, atheism's probably not likely. He feels like the universe is finely tuned because he read Luke Barnes say that it is, so therefore atheism has a 0% chance. And then Cameron can't understand why consciousness would be evolutionarily advantageous for organisms to develop, so therefore atheism is silly. And we could spend the time going through the rest of this video where Cameron then says, oh, well, what if we introduce the problem of evil? And then he makes up a bunch of probabilities to introduce that into his system. And then it shows that even if you say that a perfect God would only have a 1 in a trillion chance of living in our universe where evil exists, then even then the limited God option becomes the most probable, and atheism is still like not probable at all in his model. So that was his whole point in making this video, was to say that, oh, even if we add in these arguments for atheism, like the problem of evil, it still just makes limited theism the most probable option, and atheism still is not probable. So he says we cannot take it seriously because you can't change it to being the most probable worldview according to his very obviously made up math. That's really it. I mean, if we were just to actually analyze these arguments, not just assigning random made up probabilities to them in order to prove the point that we already thought before we started, like Cameron is doing, we would recognize that these types of things are not actually physically possible to even attribute probabilities to, because humans just cannot know enough information to actually accurately do that. And we could then start with a fundamental basis here as saying, let's just disbelieve all the claims. All right, here's the most serious way that we can approach this problem. Who has reasons why we should believe what they're telling us to believe, and who has evidence that supports it? And if we were just to be led by, in my opinion, the most serious type of approach to these kinds of big questions, and we look at who's got the evidence and who's got the reasons for believing what they do, then all of a sudden it becomes very, very obvious whose worldview is the serious one, being led by evidence and rationality, and whose worldview is the silly, improbable one that's resting upon unjustifiable assumptions and involves ludicrous things that we know never happened, like global floods, Gardens of Eden, talking snakes, Adam and Eve, and all of this random fairy tale nonsense. So yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that a critical analysis of Cameron's arguments has shown us just whose worldview is the silly one and whose worldview is supported by reason and evidence. If you like this video, check out some of my other debunking of Christian apologists, subscribe to the channel because I've got a lot more of them coming, and stay tuned for more science and history here on this channel. Till next time, peace out.